Okay, I don't really know how to start this, so I'm just going to start it. 3 years, that's how long I spent being a person I wasn't. Not in a dramatic, secret life kind of way, nothing that interesting. More like I woke up one day and realized that every single thing I did, every opinion I had, every choice I made, it had been shaped around someone else, and that someone else didn't even notice. His name was Marcus, and I'm going to tell you everything. I met him when I was 20. I know, 20 is so young, but at the time, I felt like I'd been waiting my whole life for someone to actually see me. I grew up being kind of quiet, kind of invisible, not unpopular. I had friends, I was fine, but I was never the person people remembered. I was the girl who laughed at your joke but never told one of her own, the one who went along with the plan but never suggested one. I was background, and then Marcus walked into my orbit and made me feel like I was the only person in the room. We met through mutual friends at this birthday dinner, one of those dinners where like 15 people show up and you end up sitting next to someone you've never met. He sat next to me, and he was so present, like he actually wanted to know what I thought. He asked me questions, real ones, not small talk. He remembered what I said and referenced it later in the conversation. I wasn't used to that. I thought, this person is different, and in some ways, he was. But here's the thing about someone making you feel seen, it can become the thing you're most afraid to lose. We were official within a month. Honestly, I moved fast. Looking back, there were signs even then, little things I noted and then immediately filed away because I didn't want to ruin the feeling. Like the first time he made a comment about what I was wearing. We were going to meet his friends for the first time. I was nervous, obviously. I'd spent an hour getting ready. I came out in this dress I loved. It was red, kind of bold, definitely me. And he looked at me and said, kind of casually, "Oh, you're wearing that?" Not mean, just that. Just a question that wasn't really a question. I changed. I put on something more neutral. He smiled and said I looked beautiful, and we went and had a great night. And I told myself, he just has a preference. It's not a big deal. He didn't force me. I chose to change, which was true, and also not the whole story. The first year was actually genuinely good, or at least it felt that way. We laughed a lot. We had this thing where we'd pick a random cuisine neither of us had tried and spend a Sunday cooking it badly and ordering takeout when it inevitably went wrong. He was thoughtful. He showed up. When I was stressed about my job, he'd listen for an hour without trying to fix it. But slowly, and I mean slowly, like the way a room gets darker when a cloud passes over the sun and you don't notice until it's dim, things shifted. It started with opinions. I have a lot of opinions. Strong ones, actually, about movies, about food, about what's worth being upset about what's not. But Marcus also had a lot of opinions, and his were always stated like facts, not aggressively. He wasn't the kind of guy who argued loudly. He just had this quiet certainty. And over time, I started to realize that every time my opinion differed from his, there would be this friction, a slight coolness, a way he'd look at me that felt like disappointment. So I started hedging. I think I kind of liked it. I don't know. What do you think? I see both sides, honestly. Yeah, you're probably right. It wasn't dramatic, it was just easier. And easier became normal, and normal became who I was. By year two, I had quietly rearranged my entire life. I stopped seeing my friend Jenna as much because Marcus didn't like her. Not for any specific reason, just that she was a lot, and he always seemed tense when I came home from seeing her. I told myself I was just being considerate of the relationship. That's what you do when you're serious about someone, right? You compromise. I stopped posting as much on social media because he'd made a comment once, sort of jokingly, that I was performing for an audience. He wasn't wrong that some of it was performative. That's kind of the nature of social media. But after that, I couldn't post anything without hearing his voice in my head. So I mostly stopped. I started dressing differently, more quietly. Not because he said anything. That first time was the only time he'd made a direct comment, but because I'd learned to read him. I knew what earned warmth and what earned distance, and I adjusted accordingly. like a plant bending toward whatever light it can find. I stopped telling him when he'd upset me because the one time I tried, he'd gotten very quiet and very hurt and told me he didn't realize he was such a bad partner, and I'd spent the rest of the night comforting him. I became someone who took up less and less space. And here's the thing, and this is the part that messes with me most when I think about it now. I wasn't miserable. Like, I wasn't walking around crying all the time. I still laughed. We still had good moments. There were whole weeks where things felt completely fine. That's the thing about this kind of relationship. It's not a horror story. There's no villain monologue. It's just a slow, quiet erosion. And you don't feel yourself disappearing because you're too busy trying to make everything okay. The breaking point didn't come in a dramatic fight. It came on a Tuesday afternoon when I was alone in our apartment. We'd moved in together by then, and my phone rang. It was Jenna. I hadn't talked to her in maybe 6 weeks. I almost didn't pick up, but I did. And she talked to me, like normal, like we always had. She was telling me about something stupid that had happened at work, and she was so funny about it. And I was laughing, actually laughing. And then she said, "God, I miss you. You seem like yourself right now." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she paused. And then very carefully she said, "I just mean, sometimes lately when I see you, you seem kind of muted, like you're monitoring yourself." I told her I didn't know what she meant. I got off the phone pretty quickly after that. And then I sat on the kitchen floor and I cried for 40 minutes. Not because she was wrong, because she was right, and somewhere deep down I'd known it for a long time, and hearing it out loud made it impossible to keep pretending I didn't. I didn't break up with Marcus that day. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a neat moment of clarity, and that's not really how it works. What happened was more like a slow waking up. Like when you've been in a warm room for so long you forgot that cold exists, and then someone opens a window. I started noticing things. I noticed how I braced myself before sharing news with him. Good news, even. Like I'd gotten a raise, or a creative project I'd pitched had been approved. Because I'd learned that his reaction was never quite what I hoped for. Not cruel, just tepid, slightly deflating. Like he needed to be the most successful person in the room, even when the room was just the two of us. I noticed that I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something I wanted to do without mentally calculating how he'd feel about it. I noticed that my friends, the ones I'd kept, often seemed slightly relieved when I showed up alone. I noticed that I'd completely stopped writing. I used to write all the time. Journals, little essays, nothing serious, just the thing I did to process the world. I hadn't written a word in over a year. When I tried to think of why, I remembered a night early in the relationship when I'd shown Marcus something I'd written, just a small personal essay, and he'd read it and said it was interesting, in a way that meant the opposite. I'd never shown him anything again, and eventually I'd just stopped doing it at all. I was disappearing, and I'd been so busy managing his emotions that I hadn't noticed. The actual end came about 2 months after the phone call with Jenna. We were having a conversation, not even a fight, just a conversation about what we wanted for the next year. And I said something small, a preference I had. And he did the thing he always did, which was respond in a way that made me feel like my preference was slightly embarrassing, slightly naive, slightly not quite right. And I waited for the feeling to pass. I waited to adjust. I waited to file it away and smooth things over. And instead, I heard myself say, very quietly, "I don't think this is working." He was shocked. I don't think he saw it coming. And that shocked me, because how do you not see it coming? But I think that's the thing. I'd been so good at managing it, at keeping the surface smooth, that he genuinely didn't know how far beneath the surface I'd been drowning. The conversation that followed was long and exhausting, and there were parts of it where I almost took it back. He said things that made me feel guilty. He cried. He told me I was giving up on something real, that all relationships had hard parts, that I was being unfair. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized he wasn't wrong that all relationships have hard parts, but a relationship shouldn't feel like a performance. It shouldn't feel like a constant audition for the role of someone he'd accept. I left 2 weeks later. I want to be careful here because I'm not going to tell you that everything was immediately fine. It was not. The months after the breakup were genuinely hard. I missed him, not all the time, but in waves, at weird moments. I second guessed myself constantly. I'd convinced myself that my version of events was probably distorted, that I was probably being unfair to him in my memory, that maybe I was the problem. That's the thing about being with someone who quietly makes you doubt yourself. Even after they're gone, the voice stays. It takes a while to figure out which thoughts are yours and which ones were installed by someone else. I started writing again. Slowly at first, just 3 sentences before bed, just small things, and then more. And it was like finding a room in my house I'd forgotten existed. I started seeing Jenna again. Like, properly. And she didn't say, I told you so. She's not that kind of person. She just showed up and was there. And I remembered what it felt like to be around someone who doesn't make you feel like you need to be careful. I started making choices for myself. Small ones, then bigger ones. I moved to a neighborhood I'd always wanted to live in, but Marcus had dismissed as trying too hard. I started a project I'd been sitting on for 2 years. I bought the kind of clothes I actually liked. I know that sounds dramatic, clothes. But when you've spent years dressing for someone else's approval, putting on something you actually love feels like an act of defiance. It feels like coming back. Here's what I would tell the version of me who was 2 years in and not yet ready to hear any of this. The frog in the boiling water thing is real. When something changes gradually enough, you don't feel it. You adapt. You tell yourself you're being flexible, you're being mature, you're not making a big deal out of small things. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's just survival. The sign wasn't the red dress, it wasn't any one moment, it was the accumulation. The way I got smaller and quieter and more careful over time. The way I stopped knowing what I actually thought about things because I'd spent so long thinking about what he thought. The way being with him felt like work, not rest. A relationship should not feel like a performance. The person you're with should make you feel more like yourself, not less. And if you don't know what you actually like, what you actually think, what you actually want, outside of what keeps the peace, that's worth paying attention to. That's not a small thing, that's everything. In a different place now. Not a perfect place. I don't think I'm going to do that thing where I tell you I found myself completely and now everything is great. Life is still complicated. I still have bad weeks. I'm still figuring out who I am, which sounds like it should be less confusing at my age, but apparently is just an ongoing project. But I know the difference now between a room that gets quieter when you walk in and a room that gets louder, and I know which one I'm allowed to want. If this sounds like your life right now, not all of it, maybe just some of it, I'm not here to tell you what to do. Only you know your situation. But I do think it's worth asking yourself, when did you last do something that was just for you? When did you last say something you actually believed without calculating the reaction first? When did you last feel completely, quietly, unguardedly yourself? Those answers matter. They're worth sitting with. Okay, that's the story. I feel slightly exposed, honestly. I debated whether to post this like 6 times, but I think there's something in here that maybe someone needed to hear today. If that was you, hi, I see you, and I hope you find your way back to yourself. I really do.